I want to go back and make this point once more. That is, when it comes to this tree that Paul is referring to in Romans 11, it's very clear there aren't two trees. There's one tree. There's not an Israel tree and a church tree. There's the tree that represents Israel. And not only that, but because he talks about how we, being this wild branch, are grafted in contrary to nature, and how branches that were broken off can be grafted back in, it seems to me that everybody who is part of the family called Israel, whether they were born ethnically Israel or not, they have to be grafted into the family of faith. In other words, genetically, bloodlines, those kinds of things, while I won't say that they don't mean anything, they are not a guarantee that you're in the kingdom. The tree, Israel, is a family of faith, and Paul makes that clear time and time and time again. And so if we are in the tree because of our faith, branches were broken off because of the lack of faith, then to be grafted back in, you have to be grafted in by faith, not because of who your mother and your father were. So again, everybody who is going to be considered part of Israel has to be grafted into the tree. And personally, I see the tree as being personified in the tree of life, who is the Messiah. So we have to be grafted into Messiah. There's nothing to suggest that the church was supposed to go out and start their own tree, although I believe that in a lot of people's minds, that's exactly what they think they should do and what they have done. There is nothing to suggest that the church is a different planting. The church, God's people, those who've been born again, who've come to faith in Messiah, are grafted into an already existing tree called Israel, because there's only one tree. There's only one family. So let's go now to Ephesians chapter 4 to just kind of reiterate this point. Beginning in verse 4, Paul said this: "There is one body and one spirit, just as you were called in one hope of your calling. There's one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in you all." One, not two. So once again, those who hold to the idea of replacement theology think that the church has replaced Israel, that God is through with Israel, and now he's turned his attention to the church. Obviously, I don't agree with that. We shouldn't agree with that. I don't think it has a biblical leg to stand on. But neither does the idea that there's one group of people over here that have one set of rules. They have their own path that leads to life, and we're over here as the church, if you want to say that word, and we have a different path and a different set of rules that leads to life. That doesn't have a biblical leg to stand on either. We are part of this same tree. Now, Paul did say that the wild branch is grafted in contrary to nature. Now, what that suggests to me is, well, first of all, it's a wild olive branch. It's not an apple branch. It's not a pear branch. It's an olive branch. It's just gone wild. It's grown wild. It's done its own thing. It hasn't been pruned. It hasn't been cared for. It's just kind of spread out and done its own thing, chosen its own path. And yet, in the picture of the grafting process, whoever cuts that branch from that wild tree obviously sees something of value in it. But it has to be conformed to the cultivated tree, suggesting those of us who are of the wild branch must undergo some kind of supernatural transformation. Obviously, that is going to allude to being born again, first and foremost. But I also believe that has to do with, well, if we're part of Israel, if that's the family that we've been grafted into, then we should actually behave like the family behaves. Do what the family has been instructed to do. We can't be something different. As a matter of fact, the Torah forbids the mingling of species. It's a concept that is known as kilayim, which is a prohibition against things that are different species are not to be mingled together. Things that are not intended to be mixed together should be kept apart. Leviticus 19:19, Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 9 speaks to this issue. So kilayim is about forbidden mixtures. You don't mix things together that God said, don't mix. Paul even refers to this when he, in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, talks about the fact that you and I as believers should not be unequally yoked. What fellowship does light have with darkness, or Christ with Belial? So then, based on the laws of mingling different species of seed and the prohibitions that are placed there, it's rabbinically understood that this prohibition is also going to apply to the grafting of plants and trees. In other words, the Torah speaks against, as far as the rabbis are concerned, grafting, say, an apple branch into an olive tree. If you're going to graft into an olive tree, you need to have an olive branch. Albeit, in this particular case, it's wild. So the grafting of two different species, and this is the point, is forbidden. How does that apply to what we're talking about here? Because you don't mix holy and profane, clean and unclean. You don't mix two different species of trees together. Israel and the nations don't mix. Israel and the Gentiles don't mix together. Israel is a called out nation, a set apart nation. The nations have their ways, they do their things, and God instructs His people, called Israel, not to behave as the nations. You and I have been grafted into that family called Israel, and so therefore, we're not supposed to act like the nations. We're supposed to act like God has instructed His people to act, because we can't mix two different things together. I guess what I'm trying to say, and I'll just put it plainly, is this: mixing a Gentile church and a Torah-observant Jew and try to make them one people isn't going to work. In fact, it's not even what God wants. The wild branch has to be conformed to the cultivated tree. It has to become one with the original rootstock. I say that because, as I've already alluded to or mentioned, many in mainstream Christianity considered the church to be a separate entity. They're Israel, they've got their laws, they've got their rules, they have to, follow certain dietary laws, they keep certain Sabbaths. We don't have to do that. We're the church. We're a different group of people over here. God deals with us in a completely different way. That's the mindset of many in mainstream Christianity. However, does the Bible support that notion? Does the Bible support that two different peoples, two different ways of living, two different destinies even, but yet under the same king? How can they come under the leadership of one king and yet have two different sets of rules, two different ways of living, and that takes them to two separate places? So the dogma that the church and Israel are two different things, I don't believe has biblical support. Again, the church, according to Stephen in Acts 7, was in the wilderness. What we call the church is the body of believers, the called out ones. Well, that's what Israel is called to be. And again, we've been grafted into one tree. So there's one body. There's one Spirit. There's one baptism. There's one Lord of all, not two. In Galatians chapter 3, verse 16, it says, "Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made." Not seeds. Seed, singular. Remember, the Torah forbids the mingling of diverse seeds. You don't take two different species of seed and put them together. And so there's only one seed of Abraham. And if you are of faith, then you are the seed of Abraham. So you don't mix that together with something else. That's why, once again, when Paul talks about this, he doesn't talk about a wild pear branch or a wild apple branch. He talks about a wild olive branch. It's still considered to be of the same species. It's just wild. It's not some other plant. Because once the graft takes hold, and here is the objective, this is the reason behind the grafting anyway, is that once everything is said and done, that all the branches, wild, natural, what have you, all of them are going to produce the same fruit. They're all going to produce olives. There's not going to be one branch that's natural producing olives and another branch over here producing apples and grapefruits. That's not the way it's supposed to work. They're all supposed to produce the same fruit. And why? Because they all came from the same seed, not seeds. All of this is to say that if we are in Messiah, we are not some other separate entity separated from the family of faith called Israel. We have been grafted into, we have become part of the family that God calls Israel. And because we are of faith, we don't replace, but we do take our place. We sit down at the table, we take our place with the family of God. And so Paul saw this in the very same verse in Genesis chapter 12 that 2,000 years later, a modern day 20th, 21st century rabbi in Israel saw as well. That in Genesis chapter 12, all of the families, all the Gentiles in the earth will be blessed by Abraham, literally will be grafted into Abraham. Paul saw this. So in Galatians 3, verse 7, Paul writes, "Therefore know that only those who are of faith are sons of Abraham, and the Scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel to Abraham beforehand, saying, 'In you all of the nations of the earth shall be blessed.' So then, those who are of faith are blessed with believing Abraham." And then going on to verse 29, "And if you are Messiahs, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise." So once again, Paul is quoting the same verse and chapter in Genesis that speaks of Abraham, his seed, how they are a source of blessing to the nations of the world, and how that really means that they were going to be grafted into Abraham. He's making the same observation that Rabbi Ginsburg made 2 millennia later. But he's also very clear that if you are Messiahs, you've been born again and you belong to the Messiah, then you're Abraham's seed, not seeds as of many, but one. And you are heirs according to the promise. The promise what? That was made to Abraham. What promise was made to Abraham? Well, among them, it was that I'm going to bless you, and your seed is going to be as the stars of heaven, as the sands of the seashore, and I am going to give this land to you and to your seed. So all of the promises that were made to Abraham, we have inherited through the Messiah because we are part of that family. I would add to that this, the responsibility that goes along with being the seed of Abraham has been entrusted to us as well, to do the works of Abraham, so to speak. Now, when we talk about the seed of Abraham, what does that mean? Well, I take it quite literally that we are part of this family that God calls Israel. And I know that I'm reiterating and saying this again and again and again, but I want to make very clear where we stand on this and why we believe this. But when you come and consider the natural offspring of Abraham, first, he's going to have a son by the name of Ishmael. Later, he will have a son by Sarah by the name of Yitzhak or Isaac. Now, Ishmael, according to Paul, is the son of the flesh. That's where Abraham and Sarah get together and they come up with this idea that we're going to help God keep his promise, and so go to Hagar the Egyptian. Well, that wasn't God's plan. And, by the way, it created consequences later on, not only for Abraham and Isaac and that family then, that consequence still lives with us today. But back to the point, Paul makes it clear that Isaac is the son of promise because Abraham was told, "In Isaac shall your seed," not seeds, "in Isaac shall your seed be called." So it's about the promise. It's about faith. It's not about the flesh. It's not about how we can make things happen. So Isaac is the son of promise. Isaac is the identity of Abraham's seed. But from Isaac, we come to Esau and we come to Jacob. And even though Esau is the firstborn, by the way, Ishmael, technically speaking, was Abraham's firstborn. But Esau, even though he's the firstborn, And when he's born, his heel is poised to come down on the head of Jacob. Jacob's got his hand on his heel, I believe, to shield his head from being crushed. It's not going to be Esau that God chooses. He told Rachel that the older Esau shall serve the younger. And so it's Jacob that God has chosen. It is Jacob that, as he is fleeing from Esau in the place called Luz, that God appears to him and says, I am the God of your father Abraham, the God of your father Isaac, and I'm going to make my covenant with you, and I'm going to watch over you wherever you go, and I'm going to bring you back into this land, and I'm going to make my promise to you and to your seed. And of course, Jacob, when he does return from Syria, on the eve before re-encountering his brother Esau, he meets the man who has the face of God, and they wrestle. And of course, this is the way I'd like to see it, or I choose to see it. Jacob's born again. He gets a new name. No longer will you be called Yaakov, Jacob, but you will be Israel, because you have contended with God and man and have prevailed. Israel. So he's born again as Israel. And from that point forward, he has a distinctive walk, because he's going to walk with the limp for the rest of his days. And who gave him that distinctive walk? Well, God did. The man who has the face of God. I have seen God face to face and lived. God gave him that distinctive walk that identifies him as Israel. And so from that point forward, anyone who sees him will be able to recognize who he is by how he walks. That is to say, keeping God's instructions, walking the way the family is supposed to walk. And so when you and I were born again of the incorruptible seed that is the Messiah, to as many as received him, to them he gave the power, that is the right and the ability to become the sons of God. Paul says that we, if we belong to Messiah, are Abraham's seed. What is the identity of Abraham's seed? It's not Ishmael, but it's through Isaac. It's not Esau, because Esau I have rejected, but Jacob I have loved. Jacob is born again as Israel. And when the announcement was made to Mary that she's going to conceive a child, the child she's going to conceive and then give birth to is the King of Israel. So that is the identity of Abraham's seed. And once again, just kind of reaffirming that there aren't two trees here. There's one. The only two trees that I can think of that, really, it's really important for us to remember and to emphasize is the two trees that were in the midst of the garden in the beginning. And only one of them was about life. The other one was death. And why? Because it was two different things mixed together that brought corruption and that rendered death. And so this one tree is what we are grafted into. Now, there are two branches, if you will, but those two branches come together and are one in that tree. And again, because they produce the same kind of fruit, means that they both come from the same seed. The same life force that runs through the rootstock into the trunk is going to run through the branches that are both natural and wild. The same life force runs through both of them because the same life force comes from the same source, the one and only. Now, I want to go to Ephesians just to kind of, once again, underscore what we're talking about here with some scripture. And Paul, again, writing in chapter 2, beginning in verse 12, says this: at that time, you were without Messiah. And he had just said that, remember, you once being Gentiles, that at that time you were without Messiah, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope, and without God in the world. That's how you were when you were once a Gentile. But now, in Messiah Yeshua, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of the Messiah. Now I'm going to go down to verse 19, where he says, now, therefore, you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. Now, how did they go from being Gentiles, cut off from the covenants of promise? They weren't part of the commonwealth of Israel. They had no hope. They were strangers from the covenants of promise. How are they brought near? It's because Messiah broke down that middle wall of partition. He broke down that middle wall of separation. And as I understand it, this most likely alludes to the wall or partition that was in the temple or in the temple compound. And there was a wall of separation that divided the court of the Gentiles from the court of Israel. In fact, as I understand it, there was a sign there that more or less told Gentiles, you can't go any further. You've gone far enough. That's the end. And if you cross over this line and come into this court, you may be killed. Now, I'm paraphrasing, but that was basically the message. And so any non-Israelite had to remain in the court of the Gentiles. They were cut off. They were separated. They were afar off. They were kept at a distance, and they were not considered to be part of the commonwealth of Israel. So what did the Messiah do, according to what Paul says? He tore down that middle wall of separation. He removed it. Well, what is the implication? Now you who are far off, you couldn't go in, you couldn't go past this point. You couldn't draw near the Creator. You couldn't draw near His house. Guess what? Now you can. Now you can come on in. You can cross that line and you can draw near unto God. And now you can be part of the commonwealth of Israel. You can be partakers of the benefits of this family. You can be partakers of the covenants of promise. Now you do have hope. And as a matter of fact, breaking down that middle wall of separation, Paul goes on to say, results in one new man. In fact, in verse 16 of chapter 2, Paul says that he broke down this middle wall of separation that he might take those who are regarded as circumcision, that is Israel, the Jews, those who are ethnically Israeli, and then he's going to join them with those that are regarded as the uncircumcision, that is non-Israelites, Gentiles. And so what he's going to do is he's going to take those both and make them one body, and then present them as one body unto the Father, not two separate bodies, but one body. That's the whole reason for breaking down the middle wall of separation. Now, we've read this, but obviously we haven't taken it to heart. We haven't really internalized it and then walked it out to its proper conclusion. And that is, there's only one body. There aren't two separate bodies. There aren't two wives of the same husband. There aren't two trees growing their distinctive fruits, always to be apart until we come into the until we get to the very end, and then somehow miraculously all this happens and we just kind of meet one another then. I don't think that's what it's saying. It's saying that Messiah, when He was crucified, when He was buried, when He rose again, He made it possible for these two to become one. In fact, that is why He came. Now, that brings us to the culmination, if you will, of what we've been talking about. And that is the fullness of the Gentiles. At the very beginning, I mentioned to you that some have theorized that the fullness of the Gentiles is to say that there's a certain number of Gentiles that have to come into the kingdom, that God has a number in mind, and that when a certain number of the Gentiles are saved and are on their way to heaven, then God's going to say, okay, I'm going to remove you from the equation altogether. I'm just going to pull you out of the earth. And now I'm going to turn my attention back over here to Israel. And I'm going to start dealing with them and see how many of them I can get saved. I don't think that's what it means at all. So let's go back to the tree for just a moment and consider what has to happen for the branch to be grafted into that tree. Well, first of all, as I understand it anyway, a cut has to be made in the rootstock of the tree. They have to go to the tree that they're going to graft into, and they have to take a blade and they have to cut into its side. And I want you to think about as Yeshua was hanging on that tree, what they did to him. And so that cut is made into the rootstock. Then you take the branch that you're going to graft into that rootstock, and you have to cut it as well, which alludes to the idea of covenant. Brit in Hebrew. Brit comes from a word that means to cut. Sometimes you may hear somebody refer to cutting a covenant, because covenants are very often, not exclusively, but very often affirmed in blood. And so you're cutting the side that you're going to graft into, and you're cutting the branch that's going to be grafted into this. In fact, that branch that you're grafting into it, the term is scion or sion, S-C-I-O-N, scion. But here's what that means, heir. It's an heir, H-E-I-R, because you see, if you're Messiahs, then you are the seed of Abraham and heirs according to the promise. And so you're going to take the heir, you're going to cut it, and then you're going to join the heir, the scion, to the original rootstock. Where? Where that cut was made. And if you look at it from the perspective of Romans 11, maybe that cut is made by the fact that there are branches that have been broken off because they're not producing fruit. They're in unbelief. So they're broken off. And now we've got a wound in the side of the tree. And so we're going to take this heir, this scion, and we're going to graft it. We're going to put it right there where the wound is. We're going to bind them together. Several years ago, I was in Israel, and we were visiting as a group this olive yard. There was a man who was an olive grower, and he led us through the process and showed us how you press the olives and how many different olives and how you know when they're ripe and these kinds of things. And the issue of grafting came up, and I was told during that visit that when you're going to graft into a tree, an olive tree, and you're going to do a side graft, and you make your cut, and you take the scion or the heir, and you bind it to the side of that olive tree. If it's going to take hold, typically it's going to take 3 days. In other words, when you do this, you'll know whether or not the graft is going to take hold on the 3rd day. Because at that point, this wild branch, if you will, is going to begin the process of actually conforming to the original rootstock. Those first 2 days, it just might look like a branch that just kind of got attached here, but it's not really part of the tree. But on the 3rd day, it really binds itself to that tree. It binds itself and is conformed to the original rootstock. And as a matter of fact, the gentleman also said that this process provokes healing in the rootstock where that wound, so to speak, was. It promotes healing, if I may, reconciliation. It also provokes the existing branches on this tree to be energized in some way in order to provoke more fruit. Because as a matter of fact, that's why you graft in the first place. You're wanting to provoke the tree to produce fruit. And that's what this process is intended to do. So remember, Hosea 6 told us that after 2 days he will revive us. And on the 3rd day he will raise us up that we may live in his sight. The Messiah is hanging on the tree. He's cut in his side. And what does that cut in his side represent? Where that wound was, it represents the opportunity for me to be grafted into him, to be grafted into what he represents, the tree of life, the family of God, which he is the head of. And that cut and his subsequent resurrection on the 3rd day makes it possible for me to take my place at the family table and to be considered an heir in this family. Not because of who my mother and father are or were, but because of who the Messiah is. We're in the prophetic 3rd day, and I am convinced the graft is taking hold. We'll be back in a moment.